The question for this video is how can temperature and humidity affect the health of your tomato plant? In the last months, I had my tomato plants growing and then the weather started changing because I was in Sub-Saharan Africa and it became so hot because it was the end of the winter over there and it was very hot, very dry, and basically all my plants died. So I decided to do some research and try to understand how does the temperature affect the plants, basically. So really, what does it do to the plant? Why does the plant don't like the hot? Why does the plant don't like the cold? And in particular for tomato plants, because each plant is different, right? So in this video, I will be sharing what I found by looking online, so blog articles, asking people, scientific papers, and a little bit of personal experience because, well, I'm just a beginner, I'm trying to figure things out. So in this video, we're gonna share that. Let's get started. The first problem is related to the water flow inside of the plant. So I really thought this is the base because from this problem you can have, so again related to temperature and relative humidity, you can have other problems down the line. So basically this is the source of many of the problems you can have with your plant in this area. So again, we're always talking in the context of temperature. That's the point of this video. That's why I put it first. So the water flow problem. So what I did is I tried to dig down and find the cause of why it causes water flow in the plant. So water flow is just how water will move inside of the plant's body, right? And this is affected by the transpiration rate. So transpiration is just like the plant transpires. So water comes out from the plant, and basically the transpiration rate is how fast the plant will pump water from the roots, and then the water will go up through the body, and then it will transpire from the top parts of the plants, like the stem, the leaves, etc. So this transpiration rate can be really high, can be low, and this affects the water flow in the plant. Now, what affects the transpiration rate? The thing that affects the transpiration rate is something called vapor pressure deficit. So when I was researching, that was the first time I came around with this concept. So at first it looked hard, but it's actually very simple. It's just like inside of the plant, you have a certain humidity. So inside of the plant, it's 100% humidity, the air is saturated. And outside of the plant, you again have a certain humidity level. And the difference between the inside and the outside of the plant will create a difference in pressure, and that's what, well, I guess it's like more the scientific community that use this term. That's why they call it vapor pressure deficit. And this vapor pressure deficit is actually a very good measure to know how the plants feel. You know, it's like it indicates if the plant is actually feeling comfortable, or it feels like it's suffocating, or it feels like it's drowning. So it's, if you don't want to know how your plant feels, vapor pressure deficit is what to look at. So I didn't go into technical details for this one yet, but I'm planning on making a video on that. But now I just want to know how does it affect the problems we can have regarding the temperature and relative humidity. So a low vapor pressure deficit, that's when you'll have a very low pressure between the inside and the outside of the plant. And what causes that is humid conditions. Basically because inside of the plant it's 100%, and if outside of the plant it's close to 100%, then you don't have that much pressure, and basically the plant cannot transpire that much, right? So it's kind of like it cannot transpire, it feels a bit like it's suffocating, right? Even if you are in a climate where it's super humid, sometimes you feel like you're suffocating. And I don't know if it's related to how we feel, but like the plant won't like to not be able to transpire efficiently, because that's how it moves. It helps it move water inside its body, it helps regulate the temperature. So a very low vapor pressure deficit is uncomfortable and bad for the plant. So when this happens, you can have nutrient uptake problems. Basically because the water flow, it won't be very smooth. Like the plant will be able to pump some water, but because it cannot transpire the water in the top part, you'll have some uneven flow. It's like water will go in some parts, it won't go in other parts, it might not reach certain parts, it might be faster at some point, slower at some point, so it just becomes messy. It's not a smooth flow, and you want a smooth flow. So the nutrient uptake problems then can lead to nutrient deficiencies inside of the plant because the nutrients are not traveling properly inside the body of the plant. Now, in the opposite direction, a high vapor pressure deficit, that will come when the pressure is very high. If inside the plant the humidity is really high, so 100%, but outside it's very low, let's say it's like 30%, 20%, 10%, basically the plant will start to transpire a lot because there's a lot of pressure to kind of like attract the water out of the plant. So this is that was the problems I had in Ouagadougou, so in Burkina Faso, and it was hot and dry conditions. So temperature was above 30 degrees Celsius. RH is relative humidity, and below 50% is when you can start to have the problem. So it's not for sure, but it's like the lower you go, the higher the probability of getting these problems. And there, I didn't measure the humidity in the air, but basically it was really, really low. It was the dry season, so I'm not gonna give a number because I'm not sure, but it was basically super low. And when you have this high vapor pressure deficit, you can end up with transpiration stress. So that means the plant transpires so fast, so it's actually stressing the body of the plant, and this can lead to wilting because the water flow will be disturbed. It won't be smooth. The water might actually not even reach some parts of the plant body because it transpires even before reaching this part. So especially the top of the plant can be affected, and you can have problems like the tip of the plant, the growth tip, is damaged, and this can lead to many other problems down the line when the plants start to put on some more growth. So that's it for the water flow, and yeah, it's really this vapor pressure deficit really affects the water flow in the plant, right? It can lead to these nutrient uptake problems or this transpiration stress, and this is always because the pressure difference between the inside and the outside of the plant is either very low or very high, and this affects how the water moves inside of the plant. So that's it for the first problem. Now let's move on to the second one. Another big issue you can have with the tomato plants regarding the temperature and humidity, it's with the flowers. So the flowers are fragile and they will be affected by the climatic conditions in which the plant is, and your flowers ultimately will become your tomato plants. So that's like almost directly related to the harvest you will have, and therefore it's very important to understand what is going on there. So the flower problems, there are three of them. The first one is mainly about the flower drying, so dry stigma or dry pollen. So the stigma, it's the part of the flower that receives the pollen, and when it receives it, fertilization occurs, and well, the pollen is what will fertilize the stigma, and the conditions that will cause this dry stigma or this dry pollen or when the relative humidity starts going below the 50%. So again, these are just rule of thumbs. It's not exact numbers, but it's just to try and have an idea of when the problem can start, and basically the lower you will go, the higher the probability of having this issue. And the dry stigma and the dry pollen will basically prevent fertilization of your flowers. So basically the quality of the fertilization decrease, and also the probability that the fertilization just fail also increase. So that's the first issue you can have. And then on the opposite spectrum, it's pollen clump. So it's when you have a very high relative humidity, so above 80%, then your probability of the pollen sticking to the stamen increase. So the stamen is the part of the flower, so the male part, that produces the pollen. So now if it's very humid, the pollen can just get stuck to it, and again, this will prevent the fertilization, and it might not occur because the pollen is simply stuck to the stamen. And then the third problem you can have is the blossom drop. So there are actually a lot of causes that can create blossom drop. But here again, it's in the context of temperature and humidity that we're looking at it. So blossom drop is simply the plant decide to abort its flowers. It's just going to drop the flowers because there's something that went wrong, and it's like, okay, no, I'm not putting energy there, I'm just going to drop the flowers. And what can cause that is really hot conditions, so either day or either night matters, and also cold conditions that can cause the problem. So in the cold conditions, I only put the night temperatures, but if you get also a very cold day, I'm sure it can also create blossom drop in your flower. So that's it for the 3 issues here. I didn't put more than that. I just basically looked at the different sources I had, and I took the problems that kept on coming back, what people kept on talking about, and I summarized it with these 3 issues. Now let's move on to the next one. The third problem is related to fruit. So I decided to put this one last because when I was reading about these different problems we can have with the tomato plants, I realized that the fruit problems usually are the results of the problems you had before with the water flow or the flower, because the fruits are the last stage in the life cycle of the tomato plant, and it makes sense that the problems you had before can have repercussions, direct or indirect, on the fruit and ultimately on your harvest. So here are 4 issues. The first one is a pigmentation failure. So I found this is the most straightforward. It's just it's simply that in extreme temperatures, the chemical that is responsible for turning the tomato red might not function properly, or it's not manufactured properly by the plant, and therefore the tomato does not turn red. So this one is a simple one. So I just put cold conditions, but also very hot conditions can cause that. So like below 16 degrees Celsius, you can start having these kind of issues. But that's basically when you start going into the extreme, you'll have problem. That's when even you risk the plant death. Now, uneven ripening, it might be easy to mistake it with the pigmentation failure, but in that case, it's the tomato is, it's the name explain it. Like some part of the tomato will ripen and some part of the tomato will not, and so you will have this weird tomato with some some parts that are matured and other part that stays green and are unripened or unripe. So now, what causes that? So there are 2 causes that I found. So regarding temperature and relative humidity, I'm sure there are others, but right now I tried to just keep it with this temperature angle. So the first obviously is the temperatures. So again, the extreme, so hot conditions, cold conditions, so above 32 degrees Celsius, below 15 degrees Celsius, the probability of having this problem increase. But then another main source for this is potassium deficiency, because potassium is the nutrient that is mainly responsible for the fruit development. So if you have issues with potassium, that might cause uneven ripening. And again, as we saw before, the potassium deficiency is related to the nutrient uptake problems related to the water flow problems inside of the plant. So that might be one way in which you have problems with your potassium, again related to temperature. Now, another big issue is the blossom end rot. So that's when the fruits start to rot from the bottom. So you'll basically have your tomato fruit, and at the bottom of it, you'll have this like black grayish circle starting to develop, and that's basically what is called blossom end rot. So this is mainly, it's usually related to water problems with a tomato plant. So if anything goes wrong with water, like too much water, not enough water, irregular watering, and all of these things, you can end up with blossom end rot. So the tomato plant really don't like having weird water schedules. It likes it consistent and in the right quantities. But again, blossom end rot is also one of the main sources is the calcium deficiency. So that's the nutrient related to blossom end rot. So I didn't research why calcium is related to it, but that was mainly kept coming back. Calcium deficiency is often a problem that causes blossom end rot. And again, as we saw before, so this is related to nutrient uptake problems and again water flow problems. So just by messing up with your water flows at the beginning, you can end up with all these nutrient uptake problems that can cause these issues with your fruits later on. And finally, you have immature and deformed fruits. So, well, as the name indicates, basically the fruits develop, but they develop in a poor way. And this can come from infertility issues related to the flower problems. So remember this dry stigma or pollen clump that reduces the quality of the fertilization? Well, if you end up with fertilization, but it was of poor quality, that's when you can end up with this immature and deformed fruit. That's it for the fruits. And now let's move on to the general guidelines. So basically, what are the ranges in which we can try to stay and what to avoid to basically, well, avoid all of these issues, or at least most of them. So the general guidelines here is simply to leave you with some rules of thumbs in terms of in which ranges of temperature and humidity the tomato plant likes to stay, as well as things to avoid. But again, this is just rule of thumbs. I think it's just to have an idea. Then the rest, I think it's observation. Observe your tomato plants. Try to see when some of the problems we mentioned come, and also pay attention to the climate in which you are to be able to know if things will go right or wrong. So the adequate ranges. So first, I think it's important to know that tomato plants come from moderate to warm climate, and there are a lot of things that affect the temperature and humidity they prefer. So the first influence is the light conditions, so basically how much light they get every day, as well as the growth stage in which they are. So that's basically where they are in their life. And there are 5 stages for tomato plants: the germination and early growth, the vegetative period, the flowering, early fruiting, and mature fruiting. And all of these affect the optimal temperatures. That's why it's kind of also hard to get just this like really general guidelines. I found online that a lot of the information conflicted, and I think it's because so many factors affect what the plant enjoy. So the ones I decided to go for, it's a bit arbitrary, but also I try to basically get, let's say, like the middle points and to put together all the things that I found online. So the temperature guidelines that I found is that in general the limits for the tomato plant is between 10 and 35 degrees Celsius. So outside of these limits, the plants start to die. So that's really like the physical limits for the plants. And for the general temperatures, it's between 18 and 27 degrees Celsius. So this is taking the entire growth stage of the plant, so its entire life in consideration. So that's really to have this broad overview. So between the general temperatures and the limits, what will happen is that the performance of your plant, so in terms of harvest or growth rate, or I don't know what are your performance indicators, but they will start to decrease. So for example, between 18 and 10 degrees Celsius, let's say the harvest or the growth rate of the plant will decrease, and it's when you start getting towards the 10 degrees Celsius and below that the plant will die. So yeah, it's just about how much you want to optimize, right? But this is not even that much required. Like for example, if you're just growing something outside in your garden, you just need to pay attention on the time of the year in which you plant, and basically nature and the normal climate will take the rest into its hand for you. I think it becomes much more important when you have a greenhouse and you're more in control of the climatic conditions in which your plant is. So now something else is the difference of temperature between the night and the day. So it actually matters. Usually for flowering plants, there's something called thermal periodicity. So they like to have a difference in temperature. They like to have constant shifts between hotter and cooler temperatures, and this naturally happen between the day and the night. So again, if you're just growing outside in your garden, well, it's just going to happen naturally. You just need to get your growing season right when you plant outdoor. But this is more important when you have a greenhouse. And I felt that it's also something it's good to know. It's not that practical, but it's also, again, it depends your understanding of what is going on, what your plant likes, what it needs. So the day temperature matters as much as the night temperature. So these are two things to pay attention to. And in terms of the relative humidity, finding a general guideline was a bit harder. So I just decided to go with something I found in a scientific paper, where they were saying that for the entire life cycle of the plant, the general accepted guideline was between 50 and 70% relative humidity. So other articles showed different numbers, but I tried to take this conservative estimate. But again, that is just to help you. That's just a rule of thumb. Go build up your experience, observe your plants, and adjust in consequence. So now, something I feel like it's the most important to leave you with is the things to avoid. So from what we saw, you want to avoid the extremes. So you want to avoid extreme humidity, extreme dryness. You want to avoid extreme hot conditions, extreme cold conditions. And if this happens, you want to minimize the time in which the plant is in these conditions. So you don't want them to be extended. So if, for example, if you're growing outdoor in your garden, you see that there's a very hot day, you don't want the plant to be suffering all the day. The faster you'll be able to put something like a shade cloth or something to put some shade above the plants. So the faster you can do that, the less time the plant is exposed to these extreme conditions, the better it will be for the plant and avoiding the problems we discussed. So again, you don't want the extremes to be extended, and you don't want swings. So basically, you want to have regular conditions that the plant can predict. You don't want to have brutal changes of very hot one day, then very cold another day, and very humid one day, very dry another day. And this outside, you can affect all of this in an outdoor conditions with different strategies, like shade cloth, for example. You have more leverage when you're inside the greenhouse. But there are different ways in which you can affect that, but this is not what I've researched for this video, so maybe one day we'll come to that. So yeah, that's it for answering this question. So how does the temperature and the humidity, or relative humidity, can affect your tomato plant, and basically also how it can kill it and ruin your harvest? So I hope that by now you're able to answer this question. So if you remember, we had these really three main problems, so related to water flow, related to the flowers, and related to the fruits, and each of them had their own issues, and there are some connections between the three main categories. Okay, thank you for watching till the end. I hope the information was useful for you, and I hope you go in your garden or in your greenhouse or in whatever, or in your apartment, and you put in practice what we have discussed here. I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.